Silent Hill. An amazing game and an even greater series. The Silent Hill franchise is renowned as some of the greatest games that have ever been made, with many classics in its ranks, from everybody's favorite video essay topic, Silent Hill 2, to the black sheep of the series, The Room, and all of its frustrating but horrific goodness. Silent Hill is just one of those series that really does have something for everyone, depending on which game you play. It took the already tried and true formula of survival horror and both pushed it forward and stripped it back in many ways with its first outing, and obviously with 2 taking it to an even different degree. It added a lot more psychological elements to the entire formula, making it more so a game that feels like it's internally attacking you rather than attacking the character that you're seeing die on screen. I mean, most horror games, especially during the early PS1 and PS2, they had scares like this. And yes, I know I've played this clip before, and it's a very infamous one, but you know, there's something about throwing dogs and dinosaurs through a window that, well, yeah, it will take you off guard and it will it will scare you. It's not exactly going to leave a lasting impact, the same way something as subtle as this would. And that's kind of the big hook of what made Silent Hill. Yeah, it has the monsters and it has viscerality to it. It's gross, it's intense, but a lot of times it's very intimate and introverted, quiet, and when it does try and get you, it doesn't really use jump scares as much as it just kind of breaks the silence. Silent Hill is also the entire reason that I got into horror. Back in the day when I grew up, I was scarred by my experiences as a child, being terrorized by my father with every single horror movie he watched and calling my little toddler ass into the room just to come see something horrific and run off screaming and crying. It made me turn into a little bit of a wallflower when it came to horror. But as any teenage edgelord does, by the time I was in high school, I started getting into horror literature a little bit and tipping my toes in because I just couldn't resist such great stories like Jeff the Killer and Slendy Man and all his fun tentacle goodness. But in my late teens, I started to realize that I was being silly and I should start opening my mind up to actually enjoying horror and not being a fucking toddler in a grown man's body being afraid of some stupid video games. And what really did that for me was watching this long forgotten but still great channel, Jordan Underneath. He made some fantastic videos about the Silent Hill series, and when I saw them, it really pulled me in. There was just something special about this series, something that went beyond what the others did that made me really want to just give it a chance and play it. And that's how I ended up starting off with Silent Hill 3. The one that would become my all-time favorite game, in all of its visceral, psychological glory. But there's that word again, psychological. That's a big part of what made this series what it was. It was its use of psychological horror, creating an atmosphere and world that might not have been as intense and nearly as forward as Resident Evil, or even as directly folklore related like Fatal Frame, but instead created a much more intimate sense of horror, the one I mentioned previously. It would mess with your head and cause you to really question everything around you and what symbolism they might hold and just what is actually going on beneath the surface. They were the kind of games that once you shut off and went outside, they still lingered in the back of your head, making the world around you in your real life just kind of feel off. But as beloved as this series is, and as much as I can gush about it, it's also a bit of a mixed bag. For all of its powerful stories and deep-rooted tension, it's a series that is stained with melancholy and hatred for its later titles. The post-Team Silent era, as it's been dubbed, defined by janky and broken games, riddled with god-awful writing, shallow fan service, and games that really bruise the legacy of what once was seen as the pinnacle of survival horror. I've personally tried to avoid these games after suffering through the bare minimum of Origins that I could stomach, and seeing people tear apart the other games around it, like the America Fuck Yeah simulator that is Homecoming, and the buggy mess that is Downpour. I've had very little to no interest in ever experiencing these games, beyond the occasional video that piques my curiosity. But that being said, there's always been one that's caught my interest, even if it's just a little bit. One that's made me want to give it a chance. And that's Silent Hill: Shattered Memories. A complete reimagining of the original title, taking its characters and premise and contouring them into a far more personal and heartfelt story, with a unique twist on the haunted town by making it an icy tundra rather than a fog world. Shattered Memories is probably the most original take on the series that we've received since the original Team Silent games, and if the discourse around it can be believed, it's also supposedly a bit of a forgotten gem. And that's a huge reason as to why I want to give it a chance, because if there's anything positive I can say about the post-Team Silent titles, it's that none of them are all bad. They're not good games by far. They're very fucking bad in a lot of ways, usually breaking lore and having broken mechanics and terrible dialogue and all that stuff, right? All the usual suspects. But there's some good ideas buried in almost all of them, and the one that really has the most of that seems to be Shattered Memories. Because unlike all the other ones that we've seen, like Downpour and Homecoming, it's not really trying to emulate Silent Hill at all. It's taking the premise of the original and these characters and redefining them in an interesting way. At least, that's what people want to talk about. So why don't we take a deep dive and see just what waits for us in this frozen version of Silent Hill? Why don't we give a chance to Shattered Memories?
Daddy? I love my daddy.
Yes?
The new patient is here. They're early.
That's fine. We can start now. I'm glad you came. Just turning up shows your commitment to the process. Good. I've read your notes. The other therapist didn't work out for you.
The game begins with us seated in a therapist's chair, where our dear friend Dr. Kaufman tells us a bit about what we're going to experience during our time with him, before he has us fill out a little questionnaire.
Take a look at this short form. I promise it's the only one you'll see during your therapy. Try to answer truthfully. It's easier that way.
A mixture of banal but also deeply personal questions. Even when we give them to him, he second guesses what we answer.
Never cheated on a partner, really? Okay.
Questioning what we say, and instantly giving us a sense of both unease and tension.
Let's get started then.
Before we finally fade off into our memories. The game starts off where the series began.
Cheryl! Cheryl? Sweetie? Oh my god.
The infamous car crash. As the
Cheryl?
lone father awakes,
Cheryl?
now panicked and searching for his
Cheryl?
missing daughter.
Cheryl!
As we begin to explore, it becomes increasingly abundant that we're not in the traditional Silent Hill. If all the snow and the lack of traditional fog hasn't already given that away. As I said, this is a reimagining, and this is its own self-contained experience. The environment here doesn't come across as apocalyptic or really as strange as the original. Rather, in this variation, it's not really super disarrayed and destroyed as much as it's just kind of abandoned. And it looks much more like your average dumpy East Coast town with old shops, cold streets, and gas prices that make us weep for the good old days. As Harry makes his way deeper into the town, things become more desolate and more lonely. And not in the way that Silent Hill games typically make you feel. There's no real looming sense of a monster or even a legion of creatures voyeuristically watching us through the fog. Rather, the game is just bathing us in an overwhelming sense of isolation. And as you make your way around the town, it makes you feel almost aimless. Harry calls for his daughter, yet finds no signs of life. No help from a good Samaritan, and not even a creature trying to scare you. There's just this anxious feeling of being by yourself in a strange place. Well, that is until we make our way into a TV store. The famous radio noise appears, but it seems to have taken a new use case. Rather than tell us of nearby enemies, it tells us of nearby ghosts and anomalies.
You're fielding your calls? Christ, my wife just told me about the video. You think I'm gonna let you get away with that? You wipe our wedding video? You knew that was the only copy. You can't replace that.
These give us insights into the lives of those who used to exist here. And become more blatant as we make our way through, and we enter a little playground area where we're introduced to the second variation of this same idea. In this case, a glitchy bit of the texture. Or if we pull out our camera, we see a lonely girl on a swing. An echo of the past. And I guess an allusion to the game's title. A shattered piece of a memory. But as we make it deeper in, we end up receiving a call.
Cheryl?
Daddy? Daddy?
Sweetie, you're okay? Are you at home? Sweetie, wait there. Wait for me.
You have to run, Daddy. You can't fight them. Run!
What? Is somebody with you? Cheryl! I'm coming.
And moments later, we cross through a particular door. One that traps us in a frozen maze. Running from creatures who seek to trap us in the ice. This isn't your traditional Silent Hill. Like all the other post-Team Silent games, Shattered Memories has a huge contrast in its tone and atmosphere, especially when you compare it to the original Silent Hill, which this game is a reimagining of. Though unlike its predecessor Homecoming, which is just a absolute dogshit experience overall, failing to emulate its source material in spectacular fashion, especially when it tries to do so by plucking things out of context, which, to any fan of the series, has and will annoy the fuck out of them. Shattered Memories kind of avoids this. Sort of. Shattered Memories is instead going for much more of its own thing. It takes some specific themes that the series has always dealt with, like trauma and depression, and pushes them more into the forefront, while the horror and uncanny elements that the series is really known for get more or less just pushed in the background and only really stick around as an afterthought. This is because originally, Shattered Memories was supposed to be a different game entirely. The studio behind it is Climax Studios, the same ones who developed the abortion of a game that we all know as Silent Hill Origins, a title that tries and fails to emulate the original game in the series, and, well, let's just say has a less than stellar reputation. When Climax began pitching its ideas to Konami for a new game, however, they originally wanted to do something much more akin to a spin-off, and a loose spin-off at that. This is because Climax wanted to more or less avoid the pitfalls that they had fallen into with Origins, and not have to juggle lore and risk screwing it up very easily, because anyone who knows just a little bit of Silent Hill lore knows how confusing it gets. And the other big thing they didn't want to do was have to continue any storylines or have to make yet another prequel. So, after Konami had shot them down a bunch of times with multiple pitches, eventually they came to the decision to just do a pseudo-remake of sorts, as Konami had been floating that idea around since they even started Origins back in the day, and now was the time to try and get something done since the 10-year anniversary was on its way. That's why Shattered Memories has a lot of these various weird sort of elements that don't seem like they came from the same pitch, because they obviously didn't. It's kind of a Frankenstein of multiple projects. But that's only part of what's going on here. The other big issue that is inescapable with this is, well, Sam Barlow.
My attempt. I was not the biggest fan of Silent Hill 3. I didn't like the fact they revisited the Harry storyline and some of the choices. To some extent, this was my attempt to, in my eyes, so apologies to people that love Silent Hill 3, but to redeem some of the story of Silent Hill 3 and also redeem the bad ending. So the bad ending of Silent Hill 1, like, I personally hate these kind of alternate endings that don't really coexist in these old games, right? So 99% of people that played Silent Hill 1 will play it one time and they'll get the bad ending. A very small minority of players will go back and replay the game to get the good ending. And I didn't like that as a player. For the majority of people that played that game, they would get this ending, which kind of shat on what they'd achieved. And so I was trying to redeem that.
All right. They're bad endings for a reason, you fuckwit. They aren't supposed to be enjoyable. They're called a bad ending for a reason. And Silent Hill 3 is one of the greatest games that's ever been made. Fuck, it's my favorite game. So, as a toxic fanboy, fuck your apology and fuck your shitty game. Sorry. I lost my cool there. Hopefully it won't happen again. Let's just say it's very rich hearing this fucking guy talk about how they're going to fix things, when in reality, his studio made one of the worst in the series. And that's not to mention that this game is also a broken fucking mess. Okay, sorry, it happened again, but... Alright, I guess I spoiled my feelings, but I promise, as we go on, I'll be completely fair. The big reason there's such a contrast with Shattered Memories is because the game was developed primarily for the Nintendo Wii, and motion controls were used to interact with the environment, and overall were just made a huge priority. I mean, it's an early Wii game, what do you expect? So that's kind of why its gameplay is a bit of a far cry from what you would typically expect from the Silent Hill franchise. And that's not to mention that this is also not a traditionally canon game, and it takes place in its own self-contained reality. So taking the original premise of Silent Hill, Harry Mason looking for his daughter in a haunted town, and flipping it into this thing where instead you're playing as an unreliable narrator, struggling with both his sanity and the possible paranormal shit that's happening, makes a little bit more sense. And like I said, I'd be completely fair, and if that intro piqued your interest, well, there's still a chance that this game could really hit. So let's dig a little deeper.
It's good that we touched on the car crash. That would have been a breakthrough before. But let's leave that topic for a while. I want to talk about family. It's important, right? I don't mean all that touchy-feely crap. You're not a very touchy-feely person. You're giving me that look. I'm talking too much. Well, let's have you talk, or not, or whatever you feel comfortable doing.
The big hook with Shattered Memories is its unique take on dynamic storytelling. Before each level, we'll have a little sit-down with our therapist, and he'll have us either answer some questions, fill out personality tests, or even at one point have us color in a picture. Our answers and interactions with him will end up being reflected in various ways throughout the game. For example, my beautifully colored picture is how the character models in home are actually colored in game when I go there. Another would be when Dr. Kaufman asks us what our perfect day of school would entail, and what we choose ends up being reflected on the mural in the school level. Honestly, it's one of the coolest things I've ever really seen in a game. This mechanic really adds a new layer of immersion, and because of Shattered Memories' inconsistencies and its use of the unreliable narrator trope, it actually gives us a perfect reason for things to be inconsistent and unreliable. The characterization, odd dialogue choices, and characters suddenly swapping appearance and identity makes a lot more sense, especially in the realm of we're in therapy reflecting on our memories, and so as we go through our session and we dig deeper within ourselves, our answers and our feelings may change the picture that's being painted by our mind, especially as we trudge through the various traumas of our life. What takes this whole little dynamic system with the therapy to the next level is how even when we're in the game itself, When we interact with the environment and even just what we choose to focus on and how long we focus on them, it will affect the way that things are for us. So curiosity can really kill the cat in certain ways and affect what kind of ending you're going to get, especially if you're trying to be a good little boy and, well, you can't resist.
The panty raid?
Panty raid? You're talking about girls, right? Girls?
Yeah.
And you're talking about raiding their dressers for their underpants, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, count me in.
All of this culminates in the game having widely different endings for you to get, and your choices themselves culminating in the big picture presented. But we'll get there when we get there.
When are you gonna bring in some real money? You think your crap is Shakespeare? Your piece of shit novels? No one even reads them! Be a man!
Alright, now before we get any further, let's maybe take a few steps back. I already said that Shattered Memories is a bit of a Frankenstein of some failed pitches, but it also feels like a monster built from the pieces of other games outside of the Silent Hill franchise as well. And those two big ones that really stick out to me would be Fatal Frame and Echo Knight. Now, before you confusedly ask what the fuck Echo Knight is, it's one of From Software's older franchises. Back during the Kingsfield days of the PS1, the studio would develop their own unique take on a horror franchise, and this would be in the form of Echo Knight. It was a bit of a first-person adventure game that could be seen as a cross between a walking simulator and a puzzle game, as well as a VN, but that's just most 90s Japanese games in general. Its central theme is a mystery regarding a ship that went missing, and in the quest to solve the mystery, the player will learn about the ghosts of the ship and get glimpses into their lives, as well as run from the vengeful spirits who seek to do him harm. This is similar to the central idea of Shattered Memories' core gameplay, of peering into the lives of those around us and collecting bits and pieces of their stories that give us the full picture, as well as rewarding us with various mementos with them. Shattered Memories doesn't really try to emulate this, more so it takes a lot of these mechanics and some of the overall DNA of Echo Knight and uses it to fully realize itself. It takes a lot of cues from the Fatal Frame series as well though, which is where you get the really unique mixture that this game has of these two series. Now, I know a lot more of you probably know Fatal Frame, it's not nearly as obscure as Echo Knight, but for the fair bit of you who still probably don't, it's yet another classic horror series, and one that was seen as probably the third of the big three of the PS2.
I wonder how long it's been since my brother and I began to see things other people can't see. My big brother, he was so sweet and kind. He was the only one I could open up to about these visions.
Fatal Frame was a game that yielded itself in more reality as well as fantasy than the traditional survival horror game did. Back in the day, survival horror was mostly taking on Lovecraftian cults and haunted towns, or it was having us take on corrupt corporations creating super viruses that turn people into flesh-eating zombies and powerful creatures. and other times it was a family curse of demonic serial killers. But in Fatal Frame's case, it's a bit more quiet and insular. The series would typically have us play as just normal people who end up in terrible situations. In this case, ghost hauntings that revolve around Japanese folklore. A stark contrast to just about everything else at the time, and honestly, one of the scariest series in the survival horror genre. This is mostly due to the game's core mechanic not having us fight enemies in traditional ways, or just having us be unarmed and needing to hide in the dark. Rather, we used photography to fight. Fatal Frame would have us run around with the camera obscura and go take pictures of these ghosts. Now, there's a lot of lore as to why this works, it's a bit of a magical camera, but essentially, you would have to face your fears, and that is what built the game around it. But it gave this really unique take on the idea of ghosts in games. You can't exactly just have them floating around and be able to shoot them down. Instead, you need to have a different way of attacking them, and in this case, it would be a camera. Shattered Memories takes this idea and reforms it into something else, and in this case, it would be puzzle solving, because obviously the game doesn't have any combat in it. In Shattered Memories, as I mentioned in the intro section, you'd be walking around and you'll see these glitchy texts places and not really know what they are. But if you pull out your camera and you point it at it, you'll start to see shapes, and the closer you get, the more you'll see a person or an object or just something in general. And if you take a picture of it, you're rewarded with either a message or a phone call.
Help! It's my brother! We're playing in the pump station, but the water's come up, and he's trapped! His hands are cold! His head's under the water!
But with that, I guess now would probably be the best time to talk about the gameplay. The big elephant in the room, if you will. Because Shattered Memories not only really separates itself from the rest of the series in its tone and aesthetics, but its gameplay as well. Now, to give some context here, the Silent Hill series is mostly built on the traditional survival horror gameplay loop, with resource management, logic and environmental puzzles, boss fights, and a lot of exploration. But most importantly, it is built with enemy encounters in mind. There's very few games that are able to achieve the whole survival horror aesthetic and feel without having combat. And before Amnesia: The Dark Descent, not having combat in your horror game or any sort of mechanic like that was just kind of shooting yourself in the foot. The reason games like Resident Evil cemented resource management as such an integral part of the experience was to create that stress, frustration, and ultimately fear from worrying about how many bullets you had. Did you have enough healing items to handle the next encounter? If you came face to face with the boss right now, are you going to even have a chance at surviving, let alone beating it? Now, to Shattered Memories' credit, Silent Hill never went super far into this side of things until 4, but that's one of the gripes with that game, as we'll just leave that there. But alas, it was still a part of the experience. With Shattered Memories, it just kind of throws all this away and opts to be a walking simulator, just an exploration game, which is a huge part of the Silent Hill experience, but without any real looming threats and without that thick fog obscuring everything and the constant back and forth between the real and other world in a more natural sense, it just kind of takes the atmosphere of fear and tension away. Instead, it's just, let's go find this thing. I'm lost. What's up here? Oh hey, there's another echo. Let me go see it. Hey, here's some uncomfortable information that is either very powerful and hits me in a way that actually does bring some tension, or for the most part, I don't understand the context of this, or this seems to be related to a character that's not even in the game. The the son and the stupid father from the cabin. And I just don't care about any of this, which again, if you don't care, it kills the tension. And that's the big issue with the gameplay here. It's boring, and even with its puzzles, it's still kind of boring. Most of the puzzles here are your typical Wii stuff. I go in and I touch this and I move this open and I move this door and I open this drawer and I get what's inside of it. And that's all well and good, but that's not a fucking puzzle. That is just motion controls. And it's even more frustrating if you play in the PS2 version, where we don't even get the same articulation. Instead, we just use the joysticks. And yes, I know this is because it was designed for the Wii, but still, I'm gonna complain about it because it's just boring design. Now, again, I said I'd be fair, and so to be fair, I will talk about the fact that there are a handful of decent puzzles that are a bit more traditional Silent Hill. For example, when you go into the Toluca Mall, you'll eventually come face to face with this gumball puzzle. And in order to actually solve it, you need to line up the gumballs in the exact same color scheme of the toucan mascot. This is a actually pretty fun puzzle because if you're like me and you didn't pay attention, you wouldn't notice what the exact color scheme is. I mean, you'd have to backtrack, figure it out, come back, and make sure your gumballs match. And again, this is very akin to the classic sort of logic puzzles of survival horror. But these are, as I said, few and far between. And that's kind of the big problem here. Shattered Memories is not particularly fun to play. It's not awful, and it has its moments of being very fun. For example, the school level is a great example of this game working perfectly, but for the most part, it's either just passable or boring, requiring you to really want to know the story to even bother continuing to go on. Though, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't any tension in the game. It's just not the kind of tension I think that was intended.
Yes?
Cheryl?
No, Dahlia. You want me to find her? Who's calling?
It's her father, Harry Mason. Is she okay?
Harry?
Is she okay?
Who the hell do you think you are?
Sorry? What's the...
Leave me alone!
To me.
The main tension of Silent Hill Shattered Memories is the chase segments. It's the fear that at any point you'll find yourself coming across a door or an echo that will trigger the frozen ice world to appear, and you'll be trapped playing one of the most frustrating and dog shit experiences that can be found in not just the Silent Hill franchise, but in gaming. Typically towards the end of whatever level you're in, you'll cross through a door, or like I said, you'll find a echo that will trigger the frozen hellscape of the other world to appear. And your only real task, and the only thing you can actually do here, is start running. The other world will transform Silent Hill into a frozen maze, and as you're running through it trying to find your way out, you'll also be chased by these skinny little ghoul-like creatures called Rorschachs. These are the only enemies in the game, and given the lack of combat, you just run away from them. Their only attack is when they jump on you, and you have to do a little quick time event to throw them off. All these chase segments amount to just running around like a chicken with its head cut off throughout the maze that you're stuck in, trying to find the exit as fast as you can before you get grabbed enough times for Harry to fall down and pass out, to which you will just wake back up at the beginning of the maze and do it all over again. So there's not even that big of a penalty to death in this game, because it's not even really death. And that also leads into the fact that the real punishment is just being stuck in these fucking mazes to begin with, because there's no real way to know where you're supposed to go. The game wants you to stop and open your phone, go to your map, but the map is already not the best laid out to understand where anything is, as well as it's hard to do that because once you got some of these Rorschachs on your ass, chasing you throughout the map, you don't really have a whole lot of time to stop, open your phone, and look without getting caught. And again, it just leads to a huge problem, because the game will also try to give you these little flares that you can spark up in order to scare the Rorschachs away from you. The only problem is, if you're holding that, you can't access your phone. So again, there's no real good way of trying to figure out where you're going besides the age-old trial and error, which in some of these maps is not too bad. You can figure them out pretty quickly, but some of them are just painful. The Metro is the worst example of this. That metro station is so confusing, so back-ass and frustrating, and there's just so many Rorschachs following you that you really have no time to figure it out at all. You just have to keep going through over and over and over again. It turns what would have just been a forgettable piece of nothing in this game that was just padding into an awful and frustrating experience. And again, the worst part of this is that this is the only part of the game where we get to see any monsters. You know, a huge selling point of Silent Hill, the creative and disturbing monster designs and creatures that we encounter. Here, it's just fucking lazy. We get one kind of creature and that's it. And it's one that we barely see due to us running away from them, and when we do see them, it's just before we throw them off and continue to sprint away. The devs at least tried to salvage these things by making them feel more Silent Hill-ish, by having their generic crap design shift depending on our psych profile and kind of indicate what ending we're leaning towards getting, hence the name Rorschachs or Rorschachs, you see what you get. But it's kind of useless because outside of this concept art that we get to look at and appreciate, in-game, you're not really going to have time to notice much of a difference except for when they jump on you, and even then, unless you really pay attention to their head or you get one of the atrophied ones with holes in it, you're not going to notice. It's just lazy and uninspired. And given the context in which we see these things, these cooler elements that I just mentioned are just too easy to miss. If anything, like I said, these segments feel like they're just padding. Something tacked onto the game because the original design didn't include combat and was supposed to be casual, and more than likely Konami was like, hey, this is a horror series, guys, we need something here, and they just tacked this bullshit on. And again, I say padding because you could probably beat Shattered Memories within 2.5 to 3 hours if you actually cut these chases out. But instead, here we are, running through a frozen maze, frustrated and detached from the otherwise immersive world that's been given to us. But that leads us to at least one saving grace that this game has.
Hi, this is Candy at the Honey Trap. If you're looking for a once-in-a-lifetime experience every night of the week, this is the place to be. Our girls are hand-picked for their unparalleled beauty and their dedication to the arts of pleasure. For 45 minutes with a Honey Trap Beauty, the charge is $300. This does not include drinks. We offer a members deal that awards discounts and priority booking. Ask about it on your next visit.
If you're a regular viewer of my channel, then you already know that I'm a complete sucker for atmosphere. It's my favorite part of almost any form of media, and it can oftentimes be the make it or break it for me with games in particular. It's safe to say that, at least in this regard, Shattered Memories is a fantastic piece of interactable atmosphere. Exploring around and getting lost in the town almost feels like a playable version of those Dead Mall exploration videos. And the fact that at certain points, especially during the daylight section, the world almost feels like a Source Engine game, actually helps to reinforce the loneliness and isolation of the entire experience. The snow-filled town is full of abandoned buildings, full of posters and signs. The fact that there was life here that's just vanished, and the glimpses that we get into the people who used to inhabit these spaces, it really comes together, especially with the echoes and hauntings that end up giving us direct lore and direct ideas of these people here, makes the whole walking alone in the middle of nowhere and the empty town just come to life. And of course, Akira Yamaoka's fantastic music also helps this. It pushes the entire experience to another level and allows us to audibly hear the cold emptiness that surrounds us. The atmosphere, while being unique from the rest of the series, is probably the closest thing we get to Silent Hill. It really plays into that signature feeling of the series where, even when we're supposed to be safe with no enemies around, we never quite feel like we are safe. There's just this looming feeling that something is wrong, and we just can't put our finger on it. And I think that's what makes this hit home the most, especially when you bring in the element of the phone. As we explore around, we will see posters, notes, and other little things that have phone numbers written on them. And if we call them, we'll get all sorts of different responses.
This office is closed. To reclaim a vehicle, please report to the tow lot on Cotter Street between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. Drivers will need to bring the vehicle title and a valid state driver's license. If you wish to dispute the legality of your vehicle seizure, you may obtain a review from the Parking Citation Review Manager. Good luck with that.
Sometimes it's a character confusedly answering the phone. Other times it's an automated answering machine giving us a message. It is a small little detail and element here, but it really can't be ignored. And it does, again, bring the world to life in a way that nothing else really achieves. What really pulls all of this into another level is how the atmosphere itself directly plays in with the therapy section. Our sessions with Dr. Kaufman have parallels into the world we explore and the lonely atmosphere being invaded anytime we're brought back behind the eyes of his patient. Confronted with a man who is trying to crack us, get into her mind, and figure us out, constantly calling into question the answers that we give him. These therapy sessions themselves really steal the show. They are the best part of the game. And if I'm being honest, they're the only real place where we get a true sense of tension. As throughout the game, each session feels more like a personal attack, and Dr. Kaufman's dialogue and demeanor feel more sinister and tense as the story plays out. But that's where we run into a bit of trouble. This ends up serving as a bit of a double-edged sword due to the very nature of the story itself, which is a bit of a mixed bag.
You feel guilty about everything. When we all lived in huts and wore furs, we worried over the simple things: food, water, whether animals would come and eat us in the night. Now we have supermarkets, bottled water, and .38 caliber home security. So what keeps us awake at night? More often than not, guilt. If only I had acted differently. If only I hadn't said that. If only I'd said something. You beat yourself up with your past. Don't blame yourself. Blame the world. Blame God. Blame me.
So if the gameplay is so-so at best and infuriating and awful at worst, and the atmosphere is great but requires a story to be good, then that should mean that the story itself would be the saving grace of this entire experience, right? Well, defenders of this game would tell you yes. That Shattered Memories has an amazing twist at the end and a deep, well put together plot. Well, as I mentioned before, Shattered Memories is a reimagining of the original game, and I mean, you sure do play as Harry Mason. But other than that, everything else is completely different and has almost nothing to do with the original game. In fact, all this game really does is take the original characters and tells an extremely different story, but it is, I guess, somewhat based on the ending of Silent Hill 1. If you got the bad one, you know, the one that Sam Barlow bitched about, I'm getting ahead of myself. The game starts off close enough with the crash. Harry awakes and searches for his daughter in the abandoned town of Silent Hill. The deeper he gets into the town, the more wrong everything begins to feel. The entire town is snowed in as if a tundra has swept through and decimated everything. From here, Harry meets some various characters such as Lisa Garland, Sybil Bennett, Dahlia Gillespie, and Michelle Valdez. Each of which will all have different appearances and dialogue depending on your in-game actions and choices during the therapy sessions. The story starts out pretty straightforward, but when Harry decides that he should go to his home to see if Cheryl went there after the crash, the first of what would be many contradictions is revealed, and the home he returns to and the address on his ID confirmed to be his is inhabited by another family who appear to have lived there for a long time, causing us to not only question Harry's reliability as a narrator, but reality itself. Is he going crazy, or is this some sort of weird situation where Silent Hill is rewriting reality around him? This only becomes more and more apparent as we continue with the story, Harry progressively becoming even more of an unreliable narrator, with inconsistencies in how he speaks.
Filth. Nice.
And characters like Sybil mentioning that he can't actually be Harry.
I didn't. Shut up! I know you're not Harry Mason.
And even later on in the story, other characters revealing that the daughter he's looking for has to be much older than the one that he's describing.
There you go. That's an old photo. You say she ran off?
No, we were in a car accident. That can't be my daughter.
How many Cheryl Masons could there be in a small town like this?
This is also where those mementos, echoes, and hauntings come into play, fleshing out the story and giving us more context to a lot of the areas that we explore and the type of people who inhabited them. Though, where this all comes to a head is obviously with the game's climax, and if it feels like I'm skipping the majority of the story, it's because there's really not a big there's not a lot to it. You have your inconsistencies, you have your introductions of a handful of characters, but for the most part, it's just Harry running into different contradictions and losing his mind more and more until we finally get to the very end of the game, where we see just how scrambled and unreliable Harry is, because once we reach the lighthouse, which is revealed to us to be a mental hospital, we get the game's big twist. And it's that he's nothing more than a shattered memory himself. Harry is the twisted delusion of Cheryl. She's still grief-stricken by his death, and now he exists as a figure in her mind, the figure that we've been playing as, and the choices that he makes all come together to show that this is just the visage that she has of him in her head. The game's ending here will then depend on the choices we made and our psych profile, which will show us various depictions of how Cheryl reacts to seeing her father, and if she lets him go or not. And the accompanying tape that is shown afterwards reveals to us what kind of father Harry actually was. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting idea, but it falls apart at the seams due to the psych profile system itself. Because essentially, it's thrown out the fucking window thanks to the echoes and mementos. We spent the entire game gathering messages, gathering voicemails, and learning all this lore about Cheryl, but in reality, if all the mementos solidify Cheryl's backstory, then it really renders the psychological evaluation of Cheryl by Kaufman as redundant, since we are both not privy to her backstory unless we play the game multiple times, and we can't answer the questions properly since her history has already happened, meaning that our opinions and our subjective views do not match the actual character that is being interviewed. It might affect the ending, but the mechanic here is just kind of useless because of Cheryl's mental state. All the messages and mementos are still canon, and by that, the psych profile doesn't really determine anything besides what the game chooses to show us. And by that merit, it also implies that the rest of the ending videotapes that you can get are all technically canon. So it leaves the game's narrative in this really odd place of either being futile, and no matter what choices we make and what ending we get, Harry will always end up being this shit father and husband, and Cheryl as the poster child of every bad Hollywood trope for a fatherless girl, or the narrative is just broken in its presentation, and the psych system doesn't take into account the other choices that should affect the mementos and messages we come across to better reflect the version of Cheryl and Harry that we get. Because again, if these endings are all not canon, then they all shouldn't relate in different ways to the mementos. It should be more selective, but it's not. So it puts everything into this odd problem situation where either it's all canon and we're supposed to put it all together as one big story, or it's just not told properly and everything is different. But I guess we'll never know, and well, I mean, I guess this just leads us to the game's biggest issue if we take both of these into account. At the heart of Shattered Memories lies the very familiar yet unforgivable sin that many reboots and reimaginings tend to commit. And that's the murder of the characterization of many key players in their stories. Now, before you fucking nerds start reading at me in the comments about, but Madison, it's a reimagining, I don't care. Look, I'm more than happy to give leeway to these kinds of stories, especially if they're done well. And even if they're not, bending a character to make sure that they can fit a narrative or fit the role that they've been reimagined into for the story is just something that's going to happen. No, my real issue is when you just take a name and a face, and in some cases just the name, and throw it on a character, and then the rest of their backstory, personality, and overall characterization has absolutely no relation and nothing to do with the source material. All you've done is stuck a name on a character, and that name is just there to force people to give a shit. And that's the case with Shattered Memories. It was a game marketed and set as a reimagining of the series, with its big twist really hitting due to you, the player, being familiar with its source material. Not only is it important to compare the characters with their original and reimagined incarnations, but absolutely necessary to understand their symbolism and role. Otherwise, what was the point of reimagining this thing in the first place? So, before I continue ranting, well, I'm just going to continue ranting, but why don't we get started here and just take a look at an easy character to understand. Dahlia Gillespie, or rather, Dahlia Mason, in this game. Dahlia was originally the antagonist of Silent Hill 1. She was the leader of the Order and the main source behind a lot of the cult's evil actions throughout the game. And in many ways, she could be seen as the source of Silent Hill 1's plot, being the one who wants to see the ritual to bring God into the world even if that meant sacrificing her own daughter. This is by combining both Alessa and Cheryl together, Cheryl being the daughter of Harry who went missing after the crash that was caused by Alessa at the beginning of the game. It makes the entire thing feel as if it was caused by a twist of destiny. And Harry's role in the story, especially as we uncover more and get to the end, is recontextualized in the game as less of a case of the wrong man in the wrong place, and more so a pawn that Dahlia was using to bring forth her twisted faith. Dahlia is easily able to be seen as not only just the central antagonist, but the center point of Silent Hill's corruption and the ethos of why everything happened in the first place. Now, that's a pretty easy character to understand, and one with quite a bit of symbolism and quite a bit of importance to it, right? Well, here in Shattered Memories, Dahlia Gillespie is now Dahlia Mason. Now, I know that when I called her Dahlia Gillespie in the story section, some of you probably already commented spurging to defend this game that that's not Dahlia Gillespie. Well, again, Dahlia here is two characters. One, the shitty wife that abuses Harry and ends up being the target of her daughter's grief after his death. And on the other hand, the one that I call Gillespie, because they are a slightly different characterization, is just the whore that Harry is supposed to be having an affair with throughout the story. The one he can't remember, and the one whose tits he named.
Sid and Nancy?
Who are Sid and Nancy?
My tits? You named them?
We're sleeping together?
This is a joke, right?
She's a poor attempt at a Maria, a personification of Harry's lust. And the thing is about both these characters is that they're both unlikable, unremarkable outside of the context of them being named Dahlia and the associations we have with that name. And with both characters, but predominantly the wife version of Dahlia, there's not enough screen time or dialogue to even make them important enough in the story for us to give a shit about. I mean, we see about maybe 3 minutes in total of Dahlia Mason as Harry's wife, but if it wasn't for those endings, we would forget about her instantly and only remember her as the personification of her lust, or again, this game's failed attempt at a Maria. Now, if that's not enough evidence for you or a good enough argument, then why don't we crank it up a notch? Let's take a look at how they butchered Harry, taking this stoic father figure, desperately looking to save his daughter from the peril of the haunted town, and how they transformed him into nothing but a sleazy, pathetic loser. The original Harry Mason is a widowed man who adopted a baby girl he and his wife discovered on the side of the road, and raised as their own. With his wife dying of sickness and Harry going on to support and raise his daughter, despite the grief that he suffered. And the entire beginning of the first game being caused by a twisted mark of fate when Alessa runs into the street and causes him to crash, starting off the events that we've already discussed. The Harry of Silent Hill 1 is not some infidelious cretin, and is instead played up as a caring father, something we get further confirmation on in Silent Hill 3 when we hear Heather talk about him, showing that they had a deep, loving bond, and Harry went out of his way to not just protect her, but even be overprotective in a lot of ways. Silent Hill Shattered Memories instead makes Harry into an asshole. He still loves his daughter, but depending on the ending you get, he's either a drunk, a cheater, an abuse victim, or at the very best, a dad who, despite his divorce, just wants the best for his daughter. And while that's all well and good, at least with that later point, the big problem is as we discussed in the story section, the game makes it seem as if all these are one giant canon. And if that's the case, then no matter what, Harry is just a shitty father and husband. Shattered Memories essentially took what could be seen as the personification of a strong-willed father figure, a character devoted to caring for and protecting his family, even being stricken by a deep depression and grief due to the passing of his beloved wife, and embarking on a horrifying quest to save his adopted daughter from the clutches of an evil cult, despite the horrors around him and the fact that more than likely he was going to die at the hands of these monsters just trying. But he did it anyway. And even beyond that, he's a character that raised the resulting child of that entire experience as his own daughter. And Shattered Memories chooses to just throw all that away and turn him into an unlikable prick. A man who fails his wife and fails his daughter, all in an attempt to, I guess, try to make him feel more human, but instead, just like Dahlia, all he feels like is a bad attempt at emulating Silent Hill 2 and turning him into a James Sunderland. Just maybe a less bad guy, considering there's no murder here. But in the failure of trying to transform him into a character he was never meant to be, rather than deconstructing him and making him feel more flawed and human, they just make him feel like a cartoon. Less human than he ever felt before. Now, why don't we talk about the last big one here to bring up, and that's Cheryl, the central figure of Shattered Memories itself, and possibly the most butchered character of them all. The Cheryl of Silent Hill 1 is barely even a character. They're more so just the conduit of which the story starts and ends. They're the daughter in distress that Harry has to save, and on a deeper level with the lore, the split of Alessa's soul that serves as the catalyst that causes the entire series to kick off. Her personality and characterization, though, is deepened when we play as her in Silent Hill 3, or rather her reincarnation. Here, she's an edgy but ultimately kind-hearted person who's become a competent and strong-willed individual, someone who, despite the trauma and horrifying situation that she found herself in the game's events, still has the willpower and drive to push through and survive, even seeking vengeance for her murdered father. In essence, Heather is a well-written and competent character who's defined far more than as just the survivor of a cult and the daughter of Harry. But here in Shattered Memories, all Cheryl is the product of Harry's death. Cheryl is a weak-willed, traumatized woman who has an inability to cope with the loss of her father, and falls into every badly written trope of a fatherless teenage girl. I mean, just look at all of this. It's like the writers watched every movie they could that included some troubled teenage girl character, and then threw them all into a blender to make one sad, pathetic character. She hates her mom, she's a weak-willed wallflower who gets bullied and taken advantage of sexually by her classmates and boyfriend, but also, she's a whore who has an affair with her teacher and stabs a security guard as she shoplifts from the mall, even getting arrested for what we would have to assume is due to her being violent, a thief, or drunken antics. I mean, look, even her poor pupper died. Oh no, Reddit, the fucking dog dies. No! It's just lazy and shit. 1, 2, or even 3 of these things being part of her history would make sense and round her out as a troubled character. Including all of them and having your psych profile and in-game actions affect what sort of past traumas and issues Cheryl deals with would have been a really cool addition as well, and it would have made this psych evaluation make sense. Did the trauma of her dad passing and everything happening cause Cheryl to become some promiscuous free spirit who's also violent and angry? Or did it make her become a repressed, shy, little meek person that gets taken advantage of by the wolves around her? But when you try to combine the two and have all of this wrapped into one character, it's just contradictory. She's supposedly a wallflower who allows her boyfriend to sexually assault her and takes it when some dumb broads at her school bully her, yet she's also willing to shoplift and stab a security guard, possibly even killing him just to get away with it. I mean, does that add up to you? Is that consistent of a character, or is that just fucking cheap? This stupid list is just a checklist of horrible things a character can deal with, and it comes across less like a genuine attempt at writing a traumatized and troubled character, and instead just feels like the writers went out of their way to paint the ugliest, saddest picture that they could, attempting to find every horrible thing that a kid could have happened to them growing up and tacking it on in an attempt to earn sympathy and pity from the player. They turned Cheryl into a sad, pathetic person, and someone who you're almost barred from criticizing because of the nature of the trauma she's supposed to have faced according to the story. But what makes it all the more cheap is that Silent Hill is a series known for having amazingly written characters who are complex and have suffered horrific and tragic abuses. They didn't need to throw every single trope in the book to make Angela a sympathetic and tragic character. They didn't need to make James this monster who committed every single taboo and horrific action in order to make him a complex and monstrous person. I mean, hell, even in the first game, Lisa Garland was a troubled character who was handled with grace and written in a way that allowed for us to connect and feel her humanity, as well as be sympathetic for the fate that she suffered. And, well, I mean, why don't we talk about what they did to Lisa Garland before we finish up this section? Lisa Garland, a beloved character from the original game, now personified as both a moron and a whore Harry cheats on his wife with. But hey, to cut to the part that really solidifies how lazy and poorly written this story is, Lisa is a nurse by profession. Supposedly she's been a nurse for years, yet when she gets in an accident with a bleeding head wound, obviously with a concussion, she decides to just go home and sleep on it. Yeah, the medical professional sleeps with a concussion. And before one of you decries at me, "Oh, Madison, it makes sense, it's in Cheryl's head," then that means Cheryl's an even bigger idiot than they made her. Because not going to sleep when you have a concussion is something they teach you in fucking elementary school. No matter how you slice it, this is terrible writing and poor characterization. And at the end of it all, it's just Assassination. And to bring back a point I made at the end of the story section, essentially, the game that was made in an attempt to quote-unquote fix the fact that you needed to play the game multiple times to get the correct ending requires you to play through it at least 4 times, and then piece the whole thing together and ignore its constant inconsistencies, which you'll probably just watch some stupid YouTube video to make sense of it all anyway. It renders this joke of a game all the more pathetic. Shattered Memories wears the skin of Silent Hill 1, taking its characters and perverting them into these shallow tropes of Hollywoody writing, ripping them all away from their original complexities and symbolism, and cheaply using them as a prop to make you give a shit about this game's travesty of a story, parading itself as much deeper than it really is. And that's a poor attempt at Silent Hill 2.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. I'm alone now.
Okay, let's take a step back. I did promise to be fair to the game, and maybe we should actually try and figure out why this thing is such a mess. And after just a very, very simple glossing over, surprise, surprise, it's mostly due to the hands of Konami. As I mentioned earlier on, Shattered Memories was not originally intended to be the game that it was, and 2 previous pitches of it actually existed. The first was a spin-off title named Bram's PD. This was another mixed bag of an idea, and one that, outside the obvious perspective shift into first person, had at least a couple interesting ideas thrown into it. Bram's PD was going to be an FPS Wii game where we took up the role of a detective with amnesia, and our big hook would be searching for our lost partner. This game would also include the therapy sections, but this time it would be by a police psychiatrist. Now, why somebody on the Silent Hill team thought an FPS Wii game was a good idea is lost on me, but thankfully Konami rejected the idea before it got too far, because I mean, look, is a FPS House of the Dead wannabe Wii game something you want to play in the Silent Hill series? I didn't think so. And neither did Konami, so Brands PD would end up being put on ice. The next build of the game was something a bit closer to home, and a title that got a lot more time to cook, and that would be a spin-off title known as Silent Hill Cold Heart. This title actually got some time to cook in the oven a bit, and the details that surround it show a much more fleshed out idea. This was another Wii-based spin-off title that was originally supposed to see release by 2007, and like Brands PD, the game it proposes is far different from the Shattered Memories we ended up getting. But there are some similarities, and if we go ahead and take a look at the Lost Media Wiki article about it, we can see just how interesting this idea actually was. Silent Hill Cold Heart was a pitch for a new Silent Hill game to be released for the Wii in 2007. To be developed by Climax and published by Konami, the game was centered around an emotionally unstable college student called Jessica Chambers. Struggling with nightmares and insomnia, she started speaking to a psychiatrist, shortly after deciding to visit her parents to clear her head. Lost in a blizzard, she follows an ambulance that brings her to the town of Silent Hill. The game would have had a particular emphasis on demonstrating the Wii's motion controls. The title boasted a complex character building system, where an in-depth psychological profile would be built from the player's experiences in the game. The psychological profile would go on to influence later events within the game, a rather ambitious concept for an early Wii title. Nintendo Wi-Fi connection would be used to report real-world weather and news for dramatic effect during gameplay. And this write-up isn't the only thing that would come from this. We would also get a little bit of a booklet that was drafted up for Cold Heart, and it's interesting to say the least. Obviously, Cold Heart is where the Frozen theme that Shattered Memories would come from, and deep in the mechanics of the therapy segments, and how they would affect the game's narrative and outcome. Though Cold Heart was very different, on the other hand, because it was supposed to still have combat. Now this time it would have been based on melee fighting. It would also include survival elements with a body heat system, and it would require the protagonist to be a bit of a scavenger for both food and clothes. Though how deep these mechanics go, we will probably never know. Because Cold Heart obviously never came out, and that's because, surprise surprise, Konami would end up not really accepting the draft. Well, to be more accurate, Climax would just choose not to pitch it, and would instead transform the project into Shattered Memories. And the worst part of this decision is that it feels like we got the worst of both worlds in this deal. While an FPS sounds like a really fucking dumb idea, a spin-off title that's only tangentially related to Silent Hill would have been at least a decent place to experiment with something weird like that. And Cold Heart, while I wouldn't really trust a company like Climax to make something good, especially since both the games they produced were fucking awful, Cold Heart at least sounds like it's stepping more in the right direction and has a much more interesting theme and premise to it. It reminds me of something like Silent Hill 4: The Room, where outside of the name of the series, it's ultimately a different take on the franchise that uses its separation from the mainline games to explore different themes and become a lot more creative. Especially considering Cold Heart was going to do away with the fog world for this time and actually try and do something more akin to what's been shown in Silent Hill 2, where Jessica's world, and really any other character's world, isn't always the fog otherworld that we know, but could be anything else. It was like Angela's world, but in reverse. Rather than a town encompassed in a flamey hell, this time around it would have been a frozen wasteland. But you know what? All that shit's lame. A half-assed remake of reimagining of the original game is definitely the way to go. And ding ding ding, Konami, you striked again by really making that apparent that that's all you wanted. So when Climax obliged and shifted gears, they would also decide to dumb down the gameplay, tone down the horror, all in an attempt to make something a bit more casual. And as they claim, bring a new audience to the series. And To their credit, they did at least try to make it transparent and clear that this game wasn't going to be for a hardcore audience, and that it wasn't going to be a real full-on remake, but Konami, being Konami, had to misrepresent the entire thing and advertise it as a hardcore experience.
But I remember for the vertical slice submission to Konami, very late, we were told, everybody thinks this is a remake of Silent Hill 1. So we can't show anything in this vertical slice that would make them question that truth. Which is fine, because like the opening, I don't know, it's like the opening 40 minutes, you like met the cop, you went to the diner, so it was all loosely the same. And then that became our E3 demo. So,
you know, this company just can't help but sabotage itself at every step, but the end of the day, even without the false advertising, Shattered Memories was still just a cross of a bunch of weird and underbaked ideas. And it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, what we got was a bastardization of a classic game. A ruining and a desecration of a classic story. Cutting out all the elements of what made Silent Hill what it was, and giving us a boring, messy experience with characters who are middling at best and betrayals at worst, with the entirety of the game's value being put on a twist that ultimately doesn't do much unless you were super invested into this reimagined story in the first place. So to answer the question we started with, where did all this go wrong? At ground fucking zero. Because the people who made this game obviously didn't give a shit about it. But you know what? Before I end this video, there is one more thing we do need to talk about. If there was one big thing that was going through my head the entire time I played Shattered Memories, it was that this game was a video essayist dream. There have been plenty of people who have tried to white knight Shattered Memories, going on about how deep the story is, dissecting its themes, and really transforming it into an entertaining and interesting piece of content. But that's the thing. It's just a lie and futile. I originally went into Shattered Memories hoping to turn this into yet another project like my mouthwashing or Madness Returns videos, digging deep and giving this interesting take on a game that was easily seen as just boring or decent on the surface level, but had so many different elements, story beats, and themes beneath the surface that elevate it beyond anything else. But the more I actually played Shattered Memories, the more I just felt like that would be completely dishonest. I'd be selling this thing to my audience as some sort of underrated gem full of deep story beats and blah blah blah. When the harsh reality is that Shattered Memories is not worth playing, let alone lionizing. There are a lot of video games out there that are very easy to make videos on. If you cut their footage up correctly, you can make them look like they play way better than they truly do, and if you know your general audience isn't going to go out of their way to experience them, at least not enough of them are going to do that, well, you can then flip it and turn it into anything you want, especially if you're doing it with a game that has a lot of story or is connected to a lot of lore that you can use to make look like the entire thing is much deeper than it really is. Silent Hill itself is an easy series to do that with, even with its amazing titles, because let's face it, a good chunk of modern day Silent Hill fans have never played a Silent Hill game. The only reason they like the series is because they've experienced it through the countless video essays that they watch. And I don't blame them. It's the perfect series to make content out of context with, and to flip and mold into anything you want it to be. And there will always be a big enough audience ready to eat that video up at a moment's notice. Because Silent Hill is a popular topic, it's an interesting series, but it's also a hard series to play for the majority of regular people. Unless you have some large amounts of extra cash ready to burn, or you know how to emulate games properly, you aren't going to be able to play these things. Especially one like Shattered Memories, whose PS2 port even when emulated on a powerful system runs like dirt, and even on a Wii emulator still runs pretty dodgy. And it's this barrier to entry, the fact that it's an easy game to manipulate footage of and take its story and twist it into a great video essay, selling the public on a product that simply doesn't stack up, that makes it what it is. Shattered Memories deserves the hate that it gets. It's not some underrated gem or a misunderstood classic. It's a lazy, poorly put together mess full of good ideas and interesting tidbits that never see themselves fully realized, and in turn, does everything it can to desecrate its source material. And don't let some random YouTuber try to convince you otherwise. Now, with all that being said, there is just one more thing I'd like to show you before we head out. This is my wall of shame, and these are the fantastic fans who keep the lights on around here, financially supporting the content that you watch, and keeping me chained to the computer, writing about emo nostalgia, goth music, and video games that not a single person really cares about. And hey, I couldn't thank you all enough for the support you've given. You made 2024 a fantastic year, and I hope to keep entertaining you for many more onward. But if you, the freeloader who just watched this entire video and didn't think once of giving me your hard-earned cash, well, if you want to be a narcissist and see your own name up here, or you just feel bad for a bum like me and want to throw me some scratch, links to my Patreon and Ko-fi are in the description. But with all that being said, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join the Discord server, and I'll see you in the next video.